All right, so public opinion then, moving on. Public opinion, we'll start with the definition of what public opinion actually means, because we sometimes use it in different ways. And then we'll look at how to conduct a poll, and then what recent public opinion polling tends to tell us about the way people are thinking and what that means for politics, okay? Obviously, some very well-known examples that we'll talk about, somewhat famous, maybe not famous to you, but famous among political scientists and people like that, examples of polls that got, especially presidential elections, because again, people are often paying far more attention to the presidential election than they are to other elections. So presidential elections where people got the polls really wrong, and we'll talk about why. More recently, public opinion polling with presidential elections especially has come somewhat under, not really under fire, but obviously has been less accurate. Donald Trump outperformed the polls in both 2016 and 2020, but they were so much more accurate than some of these earlier ones were, and we'll talk about that in a second, okay? And I especially like this cartoon from the 1948 election, Truman versus Dewey, all over but the shouting. A classic example, famous example, which we'll see the picture in a second, of everybody predicting Thomas Dewey to beat Harry Truman, and of course Truman won. So public opinion, what does that mean? We often hear it used as like public opinion favors this, or public opinion turned on him, or public opinion is against this, okay? That is certainly one thing that it can mean, is just a simple, what do most people think? What do they believe? In this somewhat more technical, or scientific is maybe a little grand, but this somewhat more technical, trying to be scientific meaning of it, it's not just what does the majority think or what do most people think. And as we've talked about a few times in this class, when you are talking about something like whether public opinion is in favor of or against something, that can be a matter of a simple majority, or it can mean that the most intense part of the public who really cares about that feels a certain way about something. So public opinion, when you're talking about studying public opinion in political science or the other social sciences, you're talking more about not just, sure, trying to understand what the majority thinks, especially on a particular policy question, but also trying to figure out how those different opinions are distributed among the population, okay? So what do people, over or under the age of 65, or, in all kinds of different age groups, different levels of education, different levels of income, different regions of the country, okay? Public opinion is kind of trying to figure out who believes these things, or again, how are these opinions distributed among the population? And you can break it out looking at all kinds of things: race, gender, age, geography, education, income, profession, whether or not you vote, party registration, all kinds of things, right? As well as trying to figure out, okay, the country as a whole, what do they think about, yes, maybe the Iraq War or abortion or certain high profile things that people tend to be either for or against, or at least you can try to give them a couple of maybe 3 or 4 options and ask them what they think, but also ask across a range of things and try to figure out how polarized are people. In other words, does everybody tend to agree with a right-wing or a left-wing view, or liberal or conservative? Or are these opinions, are you more likely to meet people who have opinions from sort of both parties or both ideologies? Okay, so we'll talk about that at the end of the union, okay? So public opinion, it's an attempt to get a relatively exact measurement of how different opinions are distributed among the people, okay? So it's not just majority or the voice of the people or whatever, it's how are all kinds of different opinions distributed, okay? And when we talk about opinions, political beliefs, political activity, whether or not you vote, whether or not you think politics is important, so what party you belong to, but also whether you vote at all, whether you think the politics is worth following, a lot of that, the family is the strongest influence there usually. Okay, that's called political socialization. The role of the family there is huge. Just like with religion, many people are brought up to believe certain things about politics, and again, to see certain things modeled. If your parents talk about politics, if they follow the news, if they vote, if they have strong opinions, you are likely to grow up to do the same. If they don't, if they're completely indifferent to politics, you may be the same way. Obviously, this isn't absolute. Just like with religion, people can be brought up in a certain type of house and get to a certain age and make up their own mind, change their opinions, change their beliefs. I mean, somebody may come from a household where both parents are very indifferent to politics, and they become very interested, and they become very active, and they follow things very closely, or vice versa. And obviously, 2 very conservative Parents can have a very liberal child and vice versa. So it's not like that's absolute, but one of the best predictors and one of the strongest influences on people's opinions are indeed, the family and the way that they're raised and the opinions that they pick up from the family that way. Religion, I mean, like sports teams you root for, all kinds of examples of that, okay? Politics is one of them. Okay, so polling, very important. Again, when we're trying to figure out what does the public think, we take opinion polls. We go out and we ask people, or oftentimes call them, or sometimes even contact them or use the internet to do it, but usually now calling people, okay? And you ask them, what do you think, okay? And for now, let's keep it relatively simple and focus on elections. You call people and ask them, who are you going to vote for? And the key to conducting an accurate public opinion poll is the sample, but not the size of the sample. It's not a question of how many people you have, okay? It's a question of whether you use this technique of random sampling, okay? And that means that your sample, and the sample is just the number of people who you poll, the number of people who are actually in the group that you poll, all right? That's your sample, the people that you poll. And obviously, your sample is going to be far, far smaller, much less than even 1% of the population as a whole, okay? So it might just be a few thousand people, and you're going to extrapolate from that to figure out, okay, how are people going to vote in this election? So it's crucial that you have not necessarily 1 million people responding, but that your sample is representative of the population as a whole, okay? And this gets a little bit tricky because when you're trying to predict elections, what you want is not necessarily a sample that is reflective of the population of the country as a whole. You want a sample that reflects the people who are likely going to vote, okay? So your sample for predicting an election might look very different, not very different, but might look somewhat different than your sample would look if you were just trying to figure out public opinion on any number of things, right? So random sampling is where you draw people for the sample in the same proportion as they're represented in the general population. But again, if you're trying to predict an election or if you're trying to figure out how people are going to vote, you want your sample to look like the population of likely voters, not necessarily the population of the country as a whole, okay? But you also don't want it to look like the population of Republican voters, right? So some very famous examples. Okay, Dewey defeats Truman. We talked about that. That was a simple matter of the polling was done too far out from the election. Voters changed their mind. There were not new updated polls to take account of that. So people thought that Dewey was going to win, and it was even there in the newspaper, the famous picture of, Truman seeing that, I think he was traveling, and he saw that newspaper and grabbed a copy and held it up and said, that ain't how I heard it, and so on. So, famous picture, a famous example. And there the issue was that they did the polling too early, and people changed their mind closer to the election, okay? And that can sometimes still happen. Movement between sort of convincing the opposite candidate's voters to vote for you is relatively rare. We'll talk about this when we talk about elections, but it's not unheard of. And in particular, polling, sometimes in August, you might ask somebody, who are you going to vote for? And for whatever reason, they may say somebody who they're really, if the election were today, they wouldn't really vote for them. And that's one of the tricky things about public opinion polling is when somebody answers your question, what does that really mean? How accurate is that of a picture of what they actually believe and how they're actually going to act in the case of elections, or what they're actually doing? Because in other cases, they've asked people, did you vote in the last election? And the number of people who said yes in the poll, the percentage was not much higher, but was higher than the number of people who had actually voted. So that's another issue with public opinion polling. Sometimes people report what they think are kind of socially acceptable or socially approved behaviors. They report them at higher levels than they actually do them. But another thing is if you ask somebody at a certain time, who are you going to vote for? Maybe in September for whatever reason, maybe in August, they've just seen the other person's convention. Maybe they just saw the first debate. They're thinking maybe, but they come back around and they vote for the other candidate, right? So public opinion polling, first of all, you don't want to base, if you're looking at elections, you don't want to base it too far out, right? Because people can change their minds, or they might just be not entirely serious about thinking that they're going to vote for Thomas Dewey or whoever, whenever it is, okay? Another issue is you want to make, again, your sample is accurate, that you have representative sampling, okay? 1936, the magazine Literary Digest, okay, we go back to this. There's an example of Literary Digest, one of their covers, okay? And here is, again, the idea of random sampling, the idea that you want your sample, the sample of people that you're actually asking this poll to, you want it to look like, in terms of percentages, in terms of proportions, you want it to look like the population as a whole, or again, when you're trying to predict an election, you want it to look like the population of people who are actually going to vote, or since you don't know that when you're taking the poll, who you think are likely voters. Okay, so Literary Digest poll of 1936, their sample was almost 1 million people. The population of the country as a whole was obviously smaller back then, so 1 million people, even larger, an even bigger percentage of the population than it would be now. So a very large sample, and they predicted a landslide for Alf Landon. And in fact, it was the opposite. Alf Landon lost badly to the incumbent, Franklin Roosevelt, who was tremendously popular. What happened? In this poll, who did they call? They called people, first of all, who had telephones. And in 1936, the peak of the Great Depression, or the depth of the Great Depression, even having a telephone might have been something of a luxury. But even more, they got people's information from automobile registries. And in 1936, having an automobile was absolutely a luxury. And so they basically mostly called Republican voters, people who did not like what Roosevelt was doing, basically for the rest of the country, other than the very wealthy. And Roosevelt famously said, "I welcome their hatred," talking about some of the bankers and some of the wealthy people who were opposed to what he was trying to do. Among those very wealthy people who had automobiles, they were voting for Alf Landon, for the Republican. Everybody else in the country was voting for Roosevelt. So this was a poll, this was in the very early days of polling, and it was this attempt to be scientific, or to present themselves as being very scientific, sort of the future is here, we've done a poll, we can predict this. And they were wrong, and they predicted a landslide for Alf Landon. It was the opposite, it was a landslide for Franklin Roosevelt. And they were so far off, and it was so embarrassing for them, and it hurt their reputation so much and their credibility so much, that they actually went out of business not long after that. They actually folded up because that prediction had been so wrong, and that was so disastrous for them. Okay, so again, these are dramatic examples, but the key here is, again, the importance of a representative sample, which you get from random sampling. Okay. But again, you have to be aware of what population you're trying to figure out before you figure out exactly what your random sample should look like. Okay, so in the population as a whole, people with a graduate degree might be a relatively small proportion of the population. But in the population of likely voters, people with a graduate degree may be a much higher percentage of the population. Okay, so if you want to figure out, it depends on what group you're trying to look at. Okay, when you have polls, you have a sampling error, or more often called a margin of error. Okay, this is the number of percentage points by which a poll may be off. Usually it's 3 or 4 points. Exit polls, which is when they stand outside of the polling places and ask people who they voted for and try to make an early prediction. I mean, obviously they're voting at that point, so you're going to know later in the evening, but they're still trying to maybe figure out an early prediction of who is going to win. Exit polls are a little bit more unreliable, okay, because you don't know who's actually going to stop and tell you who they voted for. So the margin of error on exit polls usually a little bit higher. On most professional, scientifically done opinion polls, the margin of error is usually 3 to 4 points, maybe just 2 sometimes, but usually 3 to 4 points. So again, if you're trying to predict an election and you're saying that it's a difference of 2 points, you might say it's within the margin of error. In other words, this poll predicts that candidate X is going to win by 2%, but that is within the margin of error. So it could actually be wrong. It could be that candidate Y is going to win by 1%. If the margin of error is plus or minus 3 points, then it could be 3 points too high for candidate X, 3 points too low for candidate Y. So rather than candidate X winning by 2 points, by 2% of the population or of the votes, candidate Y may win by 1%. If you have a poll that says one candidate is going to win by 12%, then that's not really an issue. If you have multiple polls showing that one candidate is going to win by more than 10%, you have a pretty good idea that that's probably going to happen. And oftentimes, especially in statewide elections, because good professional polls are expensive. So oftentimes in statewide elections, they may not do a lot of polls to begin with, especially in a state like Oklahoma, where one party is likely to win anyways. But once they get multiple polls showing that one candidate is very likely to win, they may just stop doing them. So you may not see many polls like for senator or governor or whatever as you approach the election, And that could be because it's not a close race. They just don't think that it's worth paying to do an opinion poll to see that one candidate is ahead by even 15 or 20 points sometimes, okay? But technique of random sampling, that's how you get an accurate opinion poll. But again, understand that the technique of random sampling needs to be tailored to the population you're trying to figure out, okay? Whatever that is. Likely voters, people in this or that party, people in this or that group, people who are likely to go and do this, okay? Okay, recently, again, we have had some issues. Basically, 2012, the polls were correct in predicting the president. Most of the pundits and the candidates, Mitt Romney apparently in 2012 was told by his advisors and genuinely believed that he was going to win the presidency, okay? Because many pundits, many cable news talking heads were saying, yes, Mitt Romney will win, especially on Fox News. Some of them lost their jobs because they were so obviously wrong. The polls, however, a lot of these scientific polls, especially a guy named Nate Silver, who still runs a website called 538, was correct. They correctly predicted who was actually going to win, okay? So 2012 was sort of the high point for the success of these public opinion polls in predicting an election, okay? 2016, in the presidential election, the polls were famously wrong. 2020, they were a little bit closer, but they were still wrong, okay? So what happened, 2016, part of it is that the national polls were largely accurate, right? Hillary Clinton did win fairly comfortably in terms of the national vote. She won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, 2%, whatever that is. But some of the individual states that she lost and therefore lost the election as a whole, because of course that's how the Electoral College works and how the presidential election works, people were not necessarily doing many polls in states like Michigan or Wisconsin because they assumed that she was going to win, just like her campaign did. So part of it was they weren't asking polls in the right state. Part of it was, again, their sample did not reflect the people who actually ended up voting. Their sample did not reflect enough members of the people who ended up turning out in larger numbers and voting for Donald Trump. 2020, basically something similar happened, okay? They kind of tried to correct based on 2016 and tried to predict that, tried to have a voter turnout that would look more like 2016 and less like the projections from 2016. And some of those groups, actually, Joe Biden did better than Donald Trump, okay? So again, a lot of this comes down to how accurate is your sample, but that is based on, in the case of an election, how accurately have you predicted who is actually going to show up and vote, okay? So it's not just how much have you done a random sample that looks like the country as a whole, how much does your random sample look like the population of people broken down by age, class, or income, race, gender, all these things of the people who actually show up and vote, okay? If there's a real disparity there, your poll results might be incorrect, okay? So probably people will be somewhat skeptical, especially in presidential elections, of polls going forward. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's, it's a little hard to tell whether these public opinion polls really affect the way that people vote. Elections happen rarely enough, and there are so many variables, so many things change from one election to another, from the candidates to all kinds of other things, that it's hard to know. But if you think that the candidate that you want to win is going to lose, and if the media is telling you that based on polls and so on, that may make you not vote. Then again, if you think that your candidate is going to win, you might decide not to vote. So a little bit of agnosticism, a little bit of uncertainty of what's actually going to happen on election day might be good for many reasons for democracy, okay? And probably we'll see more of that going forward. And, that, again, is not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously raises questions about how efficacious or how effective or how accurate polling is in general. We'll talk about that in a minute, but first of all, here are some cartoons, okay? A couple of them about how hard it is to get accurate results in these polls. The one in the top right-hand corner, it says not Romney, and he's saying it polls well, meaning that he was unpopular, which he largely was. That cartoon kind of expresses the concerns and the complaints that a lot of people have about public opinion polls and the way that they're used in elections, okay? The idea that politicians are just running polls, trying to figure out what's popular with the voters and just saying that, and possibly even governing that way, okay? When people study that, though, when they look at what politicians are doing, what they find is not so much that their substantive stances, that the policies that they advocate or oppose, that they're doing that solely based on what seems to be popular based on public opinion polls. To a large extent, what they're doing is using those polls to figure out how to win support. So when they talk about ending the Iraq War, for instance, they will poll and say, which of the following statements do you agree with? The Iraq War was an unjust war of aggression, and we should end it immediately. Okay, maybe like 18% of the people agree with that. Instead, you say we should bring the troops home and keep them safe or whatever. 89% of the people agree with that. So that's obviously a much more effective way to basically sell your idea to the public than saying that it was a war of aggression and it was unjust and never should happen. Same with healthcare. When they poll, they don't necessarily say, well, looks like healthcare reform is unpopular. They say the notion that we have an obligation to provide healthcare for all members of society, that seems to poll less well with people. That is less popular with people. Fewer people say that they agree with that statement than people say that healthcare costs are out of control and need to be brought down. Then you figure, okay, we're gonna sell this policy not by talking about how we have an obligation to provide healthcare for everybody, but by talking about how we have to bring healthcare costs down, and this policy will do that. Okay. So, and again, this kind of gets to one of these sort of paradoxes or possible contradictions about political leadership, about leadership in democracy. On the one hand, people want politicians to do, to lead, right? To be people of principle, not to just reply to or not to respond to every change in public opinion. On the other hand, obviously, it's supposed to be a democracy. So in a sense, they are supposed to be following the public opinion. They are supposed to be enacting what the people want. So one way or the other, when you look at what they actually are doing, it tends to be much more using the polls to convince the public rather than responding, just simply adopting whatever the public wants. So maybe you think that that's good because they're actually, it seems maybe a little bit manipulative or a little bit deceitful. But one way or the other, if you don't like the idea of them simply taking their cue from the public, it doesn't seem to be what they're doing in the way that they actually use public opinion polls.